So whenever you're ready, introduce yourself.
I am Chandra Galbiati. I teach 7th and 8th grade science at Tag Young Scholar in East Harlem. This lesson was sort of a conclusion wrap up to units on both genetics and evolution. I had students looking at a text that talked about eugenics and genetic testing and sort of comparing and contrasting and making some evaluations about whether genetic testing was another form of eugenics. And so it bridged information that they'd learned in the eugenics unit, also in the evolution unit.
Great. Okay, so first question is, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before the lesson and what will come after it?
It really forced students to use the knowledge that they gained about genetics and evolution in order to really understand the text and dig into it. So they had learned about genetic diseases. They had learned about how genetic diseases were tested for and how traits are passed on. Essentially, that's what genetics is about. They had also learned about evolution and why populations change in the natural world, and then also about artificial selection, and then into eugenics and how people have in the past tried to take control of that process and evaluated sort of harms done by that movement. What was the rest of the question?
What was taught before the lesson and what will come after it?
So after it, I guess another thing they had done before that was a long time ago and they didn't really delve into it much, but is definitely related. They had talked about the genetics of race and how what is and isn't actually in your genes about your race, and that connected to the eugenics movement as well. What would come after this really is sort of a wrap-up unit. So after the discussion, they sort of reflect on how their thinking has changed and get to bring in their own opinion. But this really is the end of the unit. So yeah.
Okay, good. No, that's good. Okay, so next question is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of texts designed to build skills and knowledge?
This particular text I found independently. It's not directly related to other texts, but I almost always, when I do these discussions, I give students a broad range of texts. They had a text that was about eugenics and how it had been used. It was actually the story of Vivian and Carrie Buck. They had a text about how smoking was determined to be harmful and how that science was not always common knowledge and common sense. And they might have had a text about race, but I am thinking it was long enough ago that I don't think I would put it in this unit. That was the series in this particular version. So I usually put together my own sort of series of support texts that will support my discussion text and help give students background that will really let them dive deeper into the discussion.
Talk about the standards targeted in the lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
I should have brought my lesson plan. I think that these discussion lessons really target Common Core ELA standards to a very high degree because it's really all about diving into the text, using the text to support an opinion or an answer to a question. And so both the text analysis standards about using text to support understanding a scientific text, making meaning from it, and like gathering information from that scientific text and using it in order to support your own take. They also had to use speaking and listening standards as students were listening, understanding, evaluating, and responding to things that other students were saying. I think that's...
Okay, we'll move on. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies?
That I have no idea. I'm not on the lab team.
Okay. You're not the only one. Okay, so moving on. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Bringing like a seminar discussion into science is, I think, definitely a shift from what I might have been teaching before Common Core, especially what I would have been expected to teach before the Common Core, because science right now, and especially a few years ago, was very focused on content in New York City and, well, New York State, I guess. So it's a lot about memorizing facts, and the shift to Common Core is pushing a lot more for understanding, for using the knowledge, for evaluating knowledge. And so this lesson is taking time that might have been seen as time that needed to be spent in content, and I really appreciate that I have these standards that push me to help my students really use the knowledge and build skills, discussion skills, analysis skills that they're going to need in high school and college. Outside, I think these are the skills that are really going to teach them how to think. There was something else I was going to say. I assume you're really cutting and pasting.
Oh, yeah, don't worry about that. It's all edited down.
There was something else I was going to say. Say the question again.
Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I might have just forgotten what I was.
We can move on.
Okay.
There's still a lot of information here. So, how did you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
The texts that I use for full discussion texts are usually very high level texts, and so all the students need scaffolding, not just the students who are behind grade level. And a lot of that scaffolding comes through multiple reads. The students read the text the first time, and we don't talk about what everything means. I say it's okay, if you have a question, you should write it down, and have questions about the text and wonder and say, what does this mean? And write down what the words are that you don't understand. Because the next thing we do after students get to share what their questions are is they try to answer each other's questions. And a lot of those just fact vocabulary questions can get answered by the other students in their groups. So they support each other. We also do some more scaffolding. Like in this text, there was a lot of high-level vocabulary, and so I spent a whole day where students in pairs took a word and really figured out what it meant, and then what the sentence meant that the word was in, and then they did a gallery walk between the two classes. So we had a total of, I think, like 15 to 20 different words that the students were able to see what their peers had decided it meant in the sentence. Another piece of scaffolding is just a background knowledge in a high-level scientific text. Like an editorial text like this one, there's a lot of scientific and historical background that the students needed in order to understand the text. And so they read articles, they did some research, and then they shared that out as well. And the last thing that I think helps students understand the text is that we break the text down and talk about, I usually will give a tricky paragraph to each group of students, or a tricky sentence that I think is really central to understanding the text. And oftentimes in that, I'll break them into more differentiated groups. And so that they can, the really, really hard stuff, if you put a bunch of high-level students on a very difficult, complex sentence, they usually will figure it out through discussion, and then they can share that with the other students. What does this really mean? What is it saying about the rest of the text?
Let's see here. Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in this lesson?
Huh?
Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in this lesson?
Like, did they actually learn the skills?
Well,
like the Common Core skills that I addressed. I I think almost all of the students really had those discussion skills. I don't think that they learned them specifically within this lesson. I think it's an ongoing process that they do in ELA, they do in social studies, they do in science, they do in math. And each time they do one of these high-level discussions, they'll grow a little bit. And so they get a little bit better at really digging into the text. They get a little better at really focusing on the text and not their own outside opinions.
How do you know the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
I do a lot of assessment within the discussion. I hear almost every single student speak, and I really get to hear, are they understanding the text, because they use the text to support their answers. And so I hear, do they use the text? Do they explain what it means? And also, do they explain it correctly? Did they really understand that text and the science behind it correctly as they speak? For the students who are not very vocal in the discussions, they also write a reflection after the discussion, and I get to see what their answer is. I get to see what text they found to support it, and I get to see how the discussion changed their thinking. And so if I don't hear it verbally, I often can see it in writing, what their thought process has been during the discussion, even if they didn't get a chance to talk.
Reflecting on the lesson, what worked well and what might you do differently?
I think what worked well in this lesson was the text. The students had a lot to say about the text. They were really interested in it. It was relevant to life. And so that pulled them into the discussion and really had them responding using the text because there was so much in it. I think one of the things that I would do differently, I might change my question a little bit. I think towards the end of the discussion, a lot of them were more or less in agreement, and I think I could have chosen a question that had a little bit more sides. The other thing that I could have done in that was bring in more background that would challenge their thinking. I didn't give them a whole lot about the positive sides of genetic testing. They did that a lot last year, but I think a lot of them had forgotten about it. So to really push them, give them some other perspectives that would push their thinking. Why do we still use genetic testing even if it has all of these scary implications? I also would like to have pushed them really to connect the race aspect of eugenics, and I think the way that I would have had to do that would be either to teach that lesson more recently or even just to, on the day before the discussion, to think back, what did we remember, maybe give them another article to refresh them and really have them pulling that background information into the discussion as well, because I think it gives another interesting side.
Last question is, were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
Almost every discussion that I have, I'm almost always just surprised by something someone says. Somebody has some take on the answer that I hadn't thought of. In this case, it was actually a student that I'm not sure he even quite understood what he was saying, but he said that he thought the line had to do with who was making the decisions. And that wasn't what a lot of the other students hit on, but I hadn't even thought of that distinction between common sense and scientific control, that other people are doing the control for whoever is having the babies, or doing the control for controlling the patients. And so that made me think about the text and the process of the idea of genetic testing in a new light. I don't think there were any surprising. I guess right at the very end when we were debriefing the discussion, one of the students made a comment about another student's participation that was it was specifically directed, and that student got very upset, and they started shouting back and forth, and I had to send them both out to cool down, and so that was unexpected, but they were both able to cool down, and they both came in and apologized.
Great, you're done. Good job.